Viruses are information, and information, especially when packaged in the form of an ideology, is a virus. A vaccine or an inoculation introduces a weakened form of a virus into the body for the purpose of training the immune system. And just as with classical viruses, we can imagine the same operation, informational and ideological inoculation, could be done to a population in preparation for the ideological battlefield. Over the past 30 years, the internet has been rising, and we could assume elite actors have been running full-spectrum war game simulations of how to best manage this emerging, highly complex, and maximally interconnected informational battle space. But warfare is bidirectional. If you can inoculate your own population against viral packets of destabilizing information better than your rivals, you may gain a competitive advantage. In the coming age of information war, an anti-fragile system, one that can tolerate a multiplicity of competing narratives, will win out over a fragile system. A fragile information system, one where only one narrative and one worldview is tolerated then, becomes a point of weakness and a liability to exploit. But before the next big information war commences, we must also look back at the last information war, the infliction of subjective mental reality and a delusional telos upon the Western masses, an inoculation against causality, rationality, and reality itself. Something, I would argue, which was done to facilitate the greatest theft in history, the theft of the Western middle-class wealth at the hands of the managerial elite and the managerial mesh. When the skies over Japan were first lit afire with nuclear flame 80 years ago in 1945, the great power battlefield was changed forever. Industrialized warfare between great powers suddenly became off limits almost as quickly as the shockwaves reached the edges of the tiny island nation of Japan. 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union would explode its own nuclear device, and the battle between East and West would go cold. The Cold War was conducted under the game theory constrained dynamics of mutually assured destruction, and the great powers would have to take their great battle into the domain of the abstract, the domain of ideas, information, and ideologies. In this video, we will explore the intersection of these concepts: informational inoculation, ideological war, and information war. If ideas and memes can travel instantly across our hyper-connected digital information space, certain ideas, those that most threaten power, must be prophylactically treated. And if that is the case, then an ideological vaccine of sorts must be engineered. But what kind of ideology would best fill this role? An ideal ideology would meet two primary requirements. One, it must resonate with sentiments found in a high proportion of the masses. And two, minimize the risk that a counter-elite, whether foreign or domestic, succeeds in galvanizing a significant portion of the population for the purpose of executing a regime change or revolution. To explore this landscape, we will discuss what Randall Lloyd calls subjective mental reality, or more provocatively, tertiary psychosis. A condition that he argues is the inevitable outcome of the late-stage progressivist constellation of ideologies that dominates the Western world. What better way to prevent coalescence and unification of the masses than to imprison many of them in their own hyper-unique, subjective mental realities, one far removed from the constraints of logic, rationality, and the constraints of reality itself? From inside such a construction, facts and logic, or broadly, destabilizing informational packets, will reliably bounce off its armored surface, and the risk of mass galvanization is thus neutralized, for no two subjective mental realities will be quite the same, and thus the rate of aggregate formation amongst the masses will be minimized. Such an ideology, ultimately, would be one that maximally protects the status quo. To understand and challenge power, you must understand reality, and if a large portion of the masses are infantilized and suspended within their own subjective mental reality bubbles, their ability to comprehend reality, and thus their ability to challenge power, will be neutralized. If we imagine the individuals that compose the masses as a collection of particles bouncing around, when they collide with one another, they could either bounce off one another or stick to one another. If they stick and cohere, they form a larger aggregate mass. For a revolution to be successful, two things must occur. An organized counter-elite must rise up to challenge the existing ruling class, and this counter-elite must commandeer, galvanize, and unite a critical mass of the population behind their cause of overthrowing the status quo ruling class. In our era of the managerial mesh, the system itself having grown so large, complex, and wealthy, the task of co-opting, neutralizing, or outright destroying rival counter-elites becomes a fairly trivial task. However, the risk of the populace coalescing into a unified mass must also be mitigated in order to provide the status quo with the highest degree of protection. The true elite lever pullers and strategists are, above all, expert risk managers. Thus, we could propose the managerial regime would seek to construct an ideal ideology, one that seeks to re-engineer the consciousness and psychology of the masses in such a way that they can no longer cohere and no longer form that critical mass necessary for a revolution to occur. To engineer the cognitive landscape in such a way that this critical level of aggregation amongst the masses is minimized. To prevent this critical level of aggregation is to neutralize the risk of revolution entirely, thus preserving the status quo in their crystalline palace indefinitely, or at least until a new power faction rises, one even more complex, even more capable of shaping reality, and capable of outfoxing even the savviest and most cunning status quo elite. The status quo elite dominated by the bureaucratic managers of the managerial mesh. To clarify, an aggregate is just a cluster composed of individual particles, and the process of aggregation is merely the process by which individual particles join to form a larger mass or cluster. We can imagine there exists an aggregation factor. A high aggregation factor leads to the masses coalescing into a larger and larger mass, one that could be hijacked by an organized counter-elite and used to destabilize the status quo. But if this aggregation factor is tuned and minimized by savvy ideological, cognitive, and social engineering, this rate of aggregation decreases substantially, and the risk of a counter-elite rising and galvanizing the masses into a unified weapon to wield against the existing status quo nearly vanishes. In the field of general systems theory, such a system could be modeled with something like the Arrhenius equation. In order for a chemical reaction to occur, molecules must first collide, and then only the molecules that have the right orientation and energetics will manage to overcome the activation energy barrier and result in a chemical reaction. But in our model, rather than a chemical reaction, we are thinking in terms of the aggregation rate, the rate at which a cohesive mass of people forms from individual atomized persons. In this hypothetical model, the goal of the status quo elite would be to slow the rate of aggregation, the rate at which the individual members of the masses aggregate or become bound into a bigger and bigger mass, a unified mass, that could be used by a counter-elite to disrupt the status quo. In simpler terms, we can think of this as a sort of stickiness. If two particles are not sticky, they will bounce off one another and aggregation or coalescence will be minimized. Then, we could say, the ideal status quo preserving ideology would be one that maximally atomizes the population, first by destroying their cultural and community bonds, and then, in the aftermath, seeks to keep them divided and to minimize the reaggregation rate, the rate at which the masses can coalesce and reunify, to keep the individuals that make up the masses endlessly bouncing around the pool table like billiard balls, and to keep them from coalescing into a single unified mass. In effect, to coat their bodies and brains in ideological Teflon. Perhaps, for the astute viewer, you may already have begun to notice that this set of descriptions maps very well onto the very ideological matrix in which we presently live, but you may not have thought about it in these terms. In the terms of system theory, mass action, and kinetics. This ideology under which we presently live, one that is maximally promoted and pushed by establishment institutions, power brokers, and deep state actors, goes by many names, but it has been in development for the better part of 70 years. In this video, we will both explore its developmental trajectory and also analyze it with respect to its ability to not only atomize the population, but to keep us atomized. Further, in the context of information war, perhaps, such a circumstance could even be viewed as beneficial. An anti-fragile system in which the ability of rival foreign actors to informationally destabilize your domestic population is neutralized. A coherent, unified populace can be fractured, but a pre-fractured and maximally siloed population becomes effectively inoculated against foreign information campaigns, for you cannot break what has already been broken. If you are, for example, a nation that controls the global internet, perhaps, such a strategy would provide utility, a four-dimensional chess move if you're willing to grant it, and a reversal to the age-old law that populations must be kept sufficiently unified and coherent. This idea that ideas themselves can take root in the mind and transmit from person to person, not unlike the transmission of a highly contagious viral pathogen, is a well-known phenomenon. Richard Dawkins wrote extensively on memes before the term became popularized and trivialized by its association with silly internet cartoons. And memes, ideas, ideologies, and religions are perhaps some of the most powerful civilization-shaping forces that exist. Ideologies are an abstract layer of the competitive landscape of humanity, the software. The evolutionary arms race is decided by which ideology confers the most competitive advantage. Adopt an ideology that competitively advantages your population, and you stand a better chance of outcompeting your rivals. As technology in the battlefield changes, perhaps, so too do the parameters of the ideal ideology, or in the context of information war, seek to inflict a self-defeating ideology on your rivals, and you stand a better chance at maximizing your competitive advantage. Or, conversely, seek to inoculate your own population against the informational weapons of your rivals, or against the very same weapons you employ yourself. Information is encoded in the RNA of viruses, the DNA of humans, and at the highest level of human abstraction, information is ultimately encoded mimetically in the form of ideologies and religions. In the past, the ruling class and their intelligentsia sought to engineer ideologies that would maximally advantage their nation against rival powers. Typically, they emphasized social cohesion and contained strong in-group preferences, respect for authority, respect for traditions, and things like honor. All the better to encourage the masses to wage war more ferociously on behalf of the ruling class. Glory, after all, cannot be bought with gold or silver, but rather it is bought with your life. And in the past, and in many places today, life is cheap. Martyrdom can be bought with courage and conviction, but the idea of a martyr can also be conjured and animated into existence in the instance that a logically addled, true-believing member of the mass merely gets themselves deleted at the right place and at the right time. Sometimes a martyr is merely a marionette, tethered by an invisible string under the influence of ideology and moving under the control of an unseen hand. This effect, a sort of stochastic martyrdom, wherein those who are under the influence of ideology and who are lacking an understanding of causality will directly place themselves in harm's way, is something often encouraged directly via the regime's informational apparatus and NGO networks. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, pro-social ideologies increasingly prioritized education and the development of critical skills that would enable the adopting population to outcompete others on the new emerging battlefield of innovation, technology, and industry. Before it was possible to replace the labor of the domestic masses with automated solutions, and before it was even thinkable to outsource your industrial base and means of production to overseas rivals, the ruling class had to skillfully and efficiently deploy and exploit their own domestic population for the purpose of driving their economies. But we no longer live in the past, and perhaps we have not lived there for the better part of a century. Today, we live in the postmodern era, or perhaps the post-postmodern era, and ideologies are no longer what they used to be. Today, we live in an age not of industrialized warfare, but of information war, and the combatants are both foreign and domestic. The great power battlefield no longer happens in the trenches, but in cyberspace, and the spoils are no longer physical land, but cognitive real estate. As such, the engineering parameters for an ideal postmodern ideology, just as the battlefield has changed, must change as well. From the perspective of the ruling class, an optimally engineered ideology designed to maximally protect the status quo could or should be itself a weakened form of an ideology, one that tickles the right sentiments of just the right portion of the masses, but avoids recruiting its most dangerous elements, young men, the police, and the military, into a cohesive mass that can threaten the status quo. Look around at the Western world today, and what do you see? an ideology that intentionally excludes young men, the police, and the military. If such an ideology really was hell-bent on revolution, it would seek to recruit these elements, young men, the police, and the military, to its cause, but it does not. Instead, it seeks to alienate them. Very curious indeed. Via this hypothetical ideology, the power centers would boost and promote the less dangerous elements of society, the neurotic, the physically feeble, and those with only the weakest command of logic, rationality, and causality, and animate them into a loosely bound collective that is itself under the total control of the power centers and the establishment, under the total control of the managerial mesh. And if such an ideological automata can be engineered and animated into existence via social engineering, the power-threatening transmission of destabilizing information and the resulting risk of a revolution can be controlled or outright neutralized. Although this seems sinister and unpleasant, we'll also explore the quote-unquote pro-social reversal of this informational or ideological inoculation and search for silver linings. If we are to be fully honest, the less complex informational systems of the past required a high degree of censorship, thought policing, and rigid guardrails on public discourse. Heretics were burned at the stake, forcibly re-educated, or at best, locked up in prisons. If we look around today, however, we see the total opposite, an informational landscape populated by an uncountable number of narratives, theories, and explanations, both pragmatic and more often intentionally salacious. In other words, at this very moment, paradoxically, our potential for cognitive freedom has been maximized for those who seek to pursue it. We no longer live in a system that demands rigid ideological compliance, but rather we live in a narrative kaleidoscope, one of multiplicity, and if the person wishes, one of choice and a path towards cognitive self-actualization. The cost of our present reality is that we have lost our common ground. We are no longer unified as a people. But in many ways, cognitive unification is another name for cognitive enslavement. In a world where the systems that govern us, the economic, financial, and informational systems, have become impossibly complex, we as individuals have become even less significant than tiny ants, crawling around the base of a superstructure that is as unfathomable as it is monstrous in its proportion. And we ants are maximally divided, but maximal division is merely another name for maximal differentiation, a path to cognitive self-actualization and freedom from the rigid, thought-police dogmas that were used to control and manage all past versions of human systems. Most discussions in the political arena overly rely upon whimsically waxing about how past versions of human systems were ideal, and their solutions are often overly reliant upon imagining a future where we can project the system parameters of the past onto our hyper-complex, hyper-interconnected postmodern world. Or they rely upon resurrecting ideologies of the past and reimagining them in the present. They are free to do so, but we will not do that here. Instead, we will do something else. If we are to discuss ideologies and on our journey through the process of understanding the optimal status quo protecting ideology, one that functions as a vaccine or inoculation against both revolution and information war, we must start with Marxism. Marxism, at its core, is a pure power ideology meant to create revolutionary energy, an idea pathogen that maximally resonates with the sentiments of the masses, the powerful and primary sentiments of injustice and resentment. And the class-based framing of Marxism enables it to capture the imagination of a large portion of the underclass and working class. Generally speaking, 40 to 60% of a society's population falls into the underclass or working class category, and thus an ideology catering to the underclass and working class appeals to a critical mass of the populace. Based on its mass appeal and Marxism's strong resonance with the sentiments that dominate within the masses, strong sentiments such as the opposition to exploitation, injustice, and class-based resentments, Marxism, thus, becomes an ideal ideology for fomenting revolutions, the exact kind of ideology you wish to avoid if you are the status quo ruling elite. And of course, if we allow ourselves to think in the realist framework, the nature of reality and power assures that any political system will always contain an abundant reservoir of injustice, exploitation, and potential resentments. And as such, Marxism is like a revolutionary Swiss Army knife, as all political systems will have no shortage of injustice, exploitation, and potential class-based resentments in which to exploit in pursuit of Marx's utopia. Marxism, however, never quite manages to achieve its promised utopian end state, the one that Marx said was inevitable. But it is a highly effective ideology for precipitating revolutions and in a wide variety of political systems and circumstances. And, or so it would seem, savvy operators in the West during the Cold War took note of Marxism's effectiveness and, or so I would propose, sought to re-engineer an alternative, a vaccine or an inoculation against this potent revolution precipitating ideology, an alternative variant of Marxism that would maintain Marxism's strong appeals to the sentiments of the masses, injustice, resentment, and the like, while also at the same time neutralizing its effectiveness at galvanizing a critical mass of the population, and thus neutralizing its ability to actually foment a revolution. This novel spin-off of Marxism, the one that seemingly re-engineered Marxism in such a way that its threat to power was neutralized, goes by many names, but generally it can be referred to under the umbrella of the New Left. Ostensibly, this New Left ideology was constructed by those who had become disillusioned and critical of the Soviet Union's attempt to bring about Marx's failed utopia. But just as easily, one could imagine that the intention of the New Left intelligentsia could have been to engineer a derivative version of Marxism on behalf of their patrons in the intelligence community. One re-engineered to maintain the appeal of Marxism, but one that would be guaranteed to never challenge power and the status quo. Coincidentally, Herbert Marcuse, who worked for the Office of Strategic Services in the 1940s, the predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency, is called the father of this New Left movement, and he went on to help animate this new ideology in the 1960s and 1970s. The New Left movement ultimately is the ground zero for the cascade of derivative ideologies that we hear so much about today: critical theory, identity politics, so-called wokeism, Neo-Marxism, etc. But in a much grander view, it has led us to our present psychological condition, the condition that Randall Lloyd calls subjective mental reality, or more provocatively, tertiary psychosis. When the masses are indoctrinated into a belief system that views society itself as the ultimate form of evil and rationality as the ultimate underwriter of society, then it should not be surprising that the outcome is a populace that embraces an anti-rational, anti-scientific, and maximally subjective view of reality. In the Crystalline Palace, the ruling class maintains a firm grip on logic, rationality, and systems theory, but for the masses, they are frozen out, both physically and cognitively, from these levers of power. Sit inside your self-imposed prison of emotions, sentiments, and subjective interpretations, while the ruling class is busy ruling, enriching themselves, and making the masses ever more dependent on their managerial state. How convenient. Now, to deconstruct this ideology, built by the deconstructionists, we can note that it maintains Marxism's fixation on injustice, resentment, and exploitation, but it very deftly and strategically reframes who exactly is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. In Marxism version 1.0, the underclass and the working class were oppressed by the bourgeoisie and the capitalists. In other words, it set its sights on a class-based system of oppression. However, in Marxism version 2.0, class would virtually disappear, and instead, the oppressor versus oppressed dimension would be repivoted to focus on identity characteristics: race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, sexual orientation, non-dominant religions, etc. And here, immediately, we could imagine that the set of groups is much more inhomogeneous, more complex, and more numerous than the simple workers versus the bourgeoisie framing of Marxism 1.0. In effect, it maximally subdivides the potential silos into which these oppressed groups can be nested, and thus it dilutes out its effectiveness at appealing to a critical mass of the population. If we consult the matrix of intersectionality, further, we can identify that the degree to which this oppressed group can be subdivided is almost infinite. gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical disability, mental disability, and on down the line. In effect, it begins to form the groundwork for a subjective mental reality, a world where the hyper-divided oppressed groups are not unified by a common and broad class-based struggle as it was under Marxism 1.0, but instead, the oppressed people are finally divided with ever more resolution and ever smaller sub-silos of the oppressed category. At the extreme end of this process, everyone becomes their own special and unique little snowflake, unlike all the others. In other words, the unifying and widely applicable phrase, "workers of the world unite," was replaced with something more like, "I am of skin color group A, gender group B, sexual orientation group C, gender identity group D, and disability status E, and I am now an occupier of an extremely narrow, hyperspecific sub-silo of the oppressed." Further, we could surmise, as this oppressed group is so highly subdivided, the power establishment can skillfully exploit the differences and tensions between the sub-silos, and using Marxism's other feature, schism, infighting, and purity spirals, this hyper-subdivided set of oppressed peoples could be thoroughly contained and kept distracted with moralistic narratives and schism-based infighting. Further, this new left ideology has an additional benefit of alienating the majority members of the populace that fall into the broad identity-based oppressor group category, while also alienating the so-called oppressed minorities who embrace rationality and logic over subjective flights of identity-essentialized fancy. In other words, this new ideology destroys the broad appeal that Marx's original class-based analysis had in spades, something that effectively converts this ideology into a weakened form of Marxism, just like the weakened form of a virus that is used in a vaccine. It can thus be described as a sort of ideological inoculation that wards off the risk of revolution and thus maximally protects the managerial status quo. Next, we'll do a deep dive into Randall Lloyd's book, Psychoprogressivism, The Path to Human Extinction, and trace the evolutionary path of this strange, new, and confusing ideology that is so beloved by the establishment, its handmaidens, and its foot soldiers. Ultimately, the psychoprogressivism is enabled by the truth regime of subjective mental reality, which we will also discuss in detail. To quote Randall Lloyd, the term psychosis is the root for psychoprogressive. Psychoprogressivism is primarily a condition of delusion rather than hallucination. Delusions are fixed, false beliefs. They are based on incorrect or false inferences about reality external to or about oneself, and maintain firmly or are fixed, despite the presentation of evidence that obviously and incontrovertibly contradicts the belief. And bizarre delusions involve phenomena that are physically impossible or that most people in that person's culture would regard as entirely implausible. Normal reality testing in an individual allows the amusement of reading about the exploits of magical children without confusing fantasy as real. There's also a distinction made about psychoses as relative to the source. Psychosis is primary when its source is unexplained by brain trauma, medical issues, substance use, or another known cause, which are secondary psychosis sources. Primary psychosis is related to underlying mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. Both primary and secondary psychoses are treatable, either with antipsychotic medication in the former or in treating the source of the psychosis in the latter. Proposed here is another psychosis source, not in the psychiatry books and not a medical condition, referred to as tertiary psychosis, and which is not due to a primary or secondary source. The source of this impaired reality testing delusion is socialization and education. The fixed false beliefs result from indoctrination and often constitute bizarre delusions. Tertiary psychosis has, however, a much more difficult underlying cause to treat than substance abuse. The treatment of tertiary psychosis in an individual is nothing less than deprogramming the delusions and relearning to recognize reality. On the societal level, tertiary psychosis symptoms appear as another psychological phenomenon, i.e., mass sociogenic illness. To interject, mass sociogenic illness goes by many names, such as mass hysteria and mass formation psychosis, which is the term used by Matthias Desmet and which is explored in his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Lloyd goes on to distinguish between the four fundamental types of reality. The historical understanding of reality held by intellectual elites encompasses two dimensions. The first dimension is that of its objective versus subjective nature. The second dimension is that of the mental versus physical universe. The four types of reality are therefore objective mental reality, objective physical reality, subjective physical reality, and subjective mental reality. This is the order employed by intellectual elites to constitute reality over the past 2,000 years. Understanding the development of psychoprogressivism requires consideration about these distinctions. We will not do a full deep dive into the 2,000-year history of this reality cycle in this video, but you can buy Randall Lloyd's book, Psychoprogressivism, on Amazon if you want to read his full derivation. Amazon, in its infinite big data wisdom, randomly recommended me this book, even though I've never heard of its author, nor have I ever heard the book discussed. We will briefly blitz through and summarize its trajectory, however, using touchstones from the history of philosophy as our guide. And as a note, this is not meant to be an exhaustive description of the history of philosophy, which is itself immensely complex and very convoluted. Instead, this summary will merely provide the context for discussing the subjective mental reality truth regime that dominates our present modern world. Objective mental reality can be viewed as the era of Plato and the Platonic forms. In this view, the mind is objective, and the forms, beauty, goodness, the perfect circle, the eternal forms of mathematics, etc., are in effect reality. Eventually, with the rise of Christianity, these objective mental forms were replaced by the divine mind of God, with the divine mind serving as the source of objective mental reality. At some point in around the 13th century, Western civilization was introduced to a long-dead man named Aristotle, the sort of dualist contrapole of Plato, who had laid out a philosophy of inductive reasoning, sense knowledge, and causality, and which laid the groundwork for empiricism, the scientific method, and the truth regime of objective physical reality. Eventually, empiricism and the scientific revolution began to chip away at the sanctity of the divine, while also seeking to mechanize the universe in such a way that it could be predictably manipulated and controlled for the purpose of technological and scientific progress. Rather than merely waxing lyrical about why things happen, empiricism and the scientific revolution focused on how things happened. From this, the focus drifted away from abstract discussions, moreover to the realm of the practical, efficient causes, mechanisms, the laws of motion, and logical experimentally derived scientific laws that could be used to predictably harness and control reality for the purpose of deriving competitive advantage in an increasingly complex landscape of nation-state competition. Empiricism and the scientific revolution led us to an objective physical reality, one that exists independently of the mind, and one which was dictated by mathematical laws and the empirically derived scientific laws of nature, matter, and motion. However, objective physical reality had its shortcomings, specifically its inability to deal with consciousness, the very apparatus by which humans were exploring the supposed objective physical reality. Immanuel Kant, in his analysis of the phenomena and the noumena, suggested that at best, there's a physical reality out there, but for us humans, we can only experience it subjectively through our limited human minds. The human mind, after all, is like some kind of filtering device for raw physical reality, and thus our interpretations of physical reality are themselves filtered through the a priori mental structures of our consciousness apparatus. Mental structures such as culture, space, time, and causality. Eventually, too, modern science caught up with Kant and the philosophizers when quantum mechanics was discovered and the limits of classical mechanics were realized. This combination of developments brought us into the tentative truth regime of subjective physical reality. By the 20th century, the century of great ideological battles, increased system complexity, and the rise of managerialism, the trajectory along this cycle was decidedly shifting to a final phase, subjective mental reality. To quote Lloyd, the general trend in the 20th century was toward a subjective and mental reality which has the inherent nature of being idealist, mind-dependent, and relativist, so that no individual intellectual elite can easily be credited for the development. If we place this into the context of James Burnham and the Managerial Revolution, we can perhaps see why a subjective mental reality is ultimately favored by a democratic managerial regime. In a managerial regime, the ruling class effectively becomes the managers, which are delocalized across a superstructure that I refer to as the managerial mesh, the bureaucracy of the mass state and the managerial bureaucracy of the mass corporation, along with the functional nodes of the donor-drafter class, the billionaires and oligarchs, and the NGO industrial complex. Under such a system, the managerial mesh becomes totalizing, and in an ostensibly democratic system, the populace, the voters, merely get taken along for the ride. If they don't resist, it spares the regime from having to resort to physical force, just like a mother telling her child he is going to the toy store when in reality he is going to the dentist. The Soviet Union and Communist China's version of managerialism was also plagued by subjective mental reality. The human catastrophe that was Lysenkoism, for instance, which sought to do proper communist agriculture in line with Marxist principles, most likely contributed to the starvation deaths of tens of millions of Marxist true believers and pretend believers alike. Starvation, the effect, and a shortage of food, the cause, is a classical example of objective physical reality and its companion, causality, shattering the delusions of subjective mental reality and its followers. For liberal democratic systems, if the voting populace can be re-educated into this framework of subjective mental reality, it becomes much easier for the managerial mesh to push whatever policies they wish. Policies, I would argue, that have primarily targeted the Western middle classes and their stored wealth most of all. If the voting populace is logical, rational, and self-interested, it is a lot harder to run destructive, deleterious, and wealth-extracting policies like the ones that we have seen over the past 30-plus years. Policies like forever wars, the mission to liberate $6 trillion from the Treasury, deindustrialization, outsourcing, mass migration, and the general obsession with lowering the abundance of energy and electricity in the name of staving off the climate catastrophe. The outcome after 30-plus years is clear. These policies have acted like a potent wealth pump, siphoning the wealth of the Western middle classes and concentrating it within the managerial mesh and within a network of post-national global elites. In other words, beneath the surface and behind the scenes, a very precise and rational telos lurks behind the front-facing, seemingly delusional telos. In the end, everything is utility, but I'm sure if you believe the experts, that was just a coincidence and a big misunderstanding. Whoopsie-daisy. If you can imprison a large portion of the masses, frequently those who have been more exposed to the indoctrination campaigns within universities, into a permanently infantilized state and into a bubble of subjective mental reality, they will be left defenseless against such policies. Further, these deleterious policies will always be framed in a moralistic way. Anyone who disagrees with the policies of the managerial regime is easily reduced to some bad name or the other. Intolerant, a racist, a fascist, a xenophobe, a climate denier, or some combination of scary-sounding words. If people are equipped with critical thinking and have a command of logic and an understanding of complex systems, foreseeing the inevitable outcome of the managerial regime's policies is not difficult. But if people are conditioned to reject logic, rationality, causality, and systems thinking, then all they can really do is retreat once a bad word is hurled in their direction. Further, those prone to moral self-aggrandizement will easily jump aboard the managerial bandwagon and hurl insults at those who challenge managerial policies. Effectively, this forms a self-insulating layer of virtue signalers and slogan spouters, those who are themselves causally insulated, that police the border of the managerial superstructure. And so we could say this new left ideology, one that seemingly sought to re-engineer the potent revolution precipitating ideology of Marxism into a more benign, innocuous form, one that demands an emotional, sentiment-based, and feelings-based subjective mental reality, could be instead reframed as an ideal ideology for the managerial regime that we presently live under. Maximally divide the populace into smaller and smaller identity-based silos, inflict upon them a subjective mental reality, and deprive them of the tools of logic, rationality, mathematics, and causality, and we could easily see how revolutionary challenge to the managerial system could be skillfully engineered away by clever, ideological, cognitive, and social engineering. Before we explore this managerially optimal ideology further within Randall Lloyd's framework, we can stop first and check in with James Burnham, who in the 1940s was only speculating on what the Western version of the managerial ideology would become. The 20th century was the century in which the managerial ideologies were born. Fascism, Nazism, and Leninism, Stalinism, at the time of Burnham's writings, were already conceptualized and implemented, but the liberal democracies of the West were still lagging in their own homegrown managerial variants. In Burnham's day, Western managerial ideology was still in its infancy. New Dealism and technocracy were not yet fully formalized, but from our vantage point in 2026, we can check back in with Burnham and what he conjectured. Specifically with regard to technocracy, Burnham wrote, "Technocracy is another example of an American variant of the managerial ideologies. As a matter of fact, technocracy's failure to gain a wide response can be attributed in part to its too plain and open way in which it expresses the perspective of managerial society. Yet the society about which the technocrats write is quite obviously managerial society, and within it, their technocrats are quite obviously the managerial ruling class. The theory, technocracy, is not dressed up enough for major ideological purposes. It fails also in refusing to devote sufficient attention to the problem of power, which so prominently occupies communism and fascism. However, the developed American managerial ideologies of the future will doubtless incorporate technocratic propaganda, for it seems on the whole well adapted to the propaganda needs in this country." Now here, we can note Burnham's observation. In the 1940s, technocracy lacked a framework for discussing power, and it had not yet found a sentiment-based angle on which to base the propaganda that it would need to fully indoctrinate its masses. But here, we can return to Randall Lloyd's outline of our descent into subjective mental reality and the rise of the New Left movement, which was being formulated at the exact same time that Burnham was noting the lack of ideological red meat on the bones of this embryonic technocratic ideology. As we will see, they borrowed much from the Marxist framework, specifically Marxism's utopian fixation on eliminating oppression and injustice, while also skillfully, or so it would seem, re-engineering Marxism in such a way that the masses would be maximally divided, neutralized, and imprisoned within their subjective mental bubbles. To begin with, we will discuss the two primary forms of the state, Nomocracy and Teleocracy. The liberal democracies of the West, prior to the silent Managerial Revolution, were nomocracies. To quote Lloyd, "Nomology, from the Greek word nomos for law and logos for reason, is the understanding of causality based on rules or of agency. Nomocracy, rule according to laws, as a political orientation, is a tendency towards policymaking as a process. Democracy, that is, true majoritarianism reflecting the aggregation of individual choices, not quote-unquote democracy, that is, the tyranny of a cadre, is a rules-based decision-making type." F.A. Hayek, along with other scholars, have pointed out that nomocracy, rule according to laws, is the only means by which to guarantee liberty. But for those seeking to totalize and centralize all power, liberty is something to fear and something to be sidelined and circumnavigated at all costs. Pesky laws enshrined in our Constitution, freedom of speech and the right to bear arms, for instance, are especially problematic. The problem of laws was something, coincidentally, the deconstructionists would later chip away at wholeheartedly. So if we place ourselves back into the 1940s and in the time in which Burnham was speculating on what ideological direction Western managerialism would head, we can say that the ideological engineers of the past century would have set their sights primarily on destroying our rules-based order and replacing it with something else, a teleocracy, the form preferred by managerialism. Returning to Lloyd, teleology, from the Greek word telos for end and logos for reason, is an explanation for something as a function of its end, purpose, or goal, as opposed to a function of its cause or process. Teleocracy, rule according to ends, as a political orientation, is a tendency towards policymaking as an outcome or by design. From this description, perhaps, we can see how a teleocracy grants much more latitude and power to the ruling class. It throws away causality and the rules-based order and instead fixates entirely on the ends, the purpose, or the goal. Realistically, this is the stated or claimed goal behind policies. the stated or claimed goal, which is broadcast and amplified by the establishment's information infrastructure and propagandists, an end that is often entirely different than what inevitably materializes decades later in the form of measurable results. So we could say there is a stated telos and a revealed telos. By the time it is revealed, it's too late, and they've already moved on to the next scheme. But again, with the aid of subjective mental reality, the rejection of rationality, causality, logic, and systems thinking, the subjective stated intent, and the alleged sentiment and feelings behind managerial policies is all that matters. They were just trying to do the right thing, don't you know, and they just fell short of achieving their utopia. But please disregard the fact that their policy decisions did an exceptional job at impoverishing us, extracting our wealth and our futures, and the managerial elite just so happened to have become wealthier than ever before as a result of these policies. But that is pesky cause and effect, don't you know, and you shouldn't trouble your little head about that. This is the outcome of teleocracies. Power tells you some silly fairy tale that doesn't come true, while they are busy behind the scenes, skillfully executing the true end, the true purpose, and their true goal, to make you poorer, more dependent on the state, stupider, and suspended in their cage, one of subjectivity, dogma, emotions, anti-rationality, and a sentiment-based, subjective mental reality. Now here we can think back to our previous narrative vector and utility vector framework. In this framework, we discussed that the narrative vector typically represents the subjective, moralistic narrative behind policies, the stated telos, saving the planet from combusting due to climate change, fighting injustice, or pursuing equity, for example. And somewhere hidden behind the scenes lurks the much more covert utility vector, the revealed telos, the instrumental utility that the policies serve with respect to the ruling class, the managerial elite, and the hyper-wealthy. Things like wealth extraction, sending all your jobs overseas, debt enslavement, and importing a massive amount of immigrants into a shrinking economy plagued by inflation, job scarcity, and a gutted industrial base to compete with you for ever lower and lower wages. But I suppose if you are one of the denizens of subjective mental reality, you get to feel smug and signal your virtue. You can morally self-aggrandize from atop the managerial bandwagon and feel secure in your own sense of moral superiority, the consolation prize for those who are dogma-bound foot soldiers of the managerial regime. But returning to Lloyd and Nomocracy and Teleocracy, the economist F.A. Hayek presented an argument for Nomocracy that rests on rules and Teleocracy that rests on ends. For Nomocracy, the public good, or the general welfare, consists solely in the preservation of that abstract and end-independent order, which is secured by obedience to abstract rules of just conduct. For Teleocracy, the common good consists of the sum of particular interests, that is, the sum of concrete foreseeable results affecting particular people or groups. And here we can point out cynically that under Teleocracy, the common good of the so-called particular people or particular groups is most often not the masses, but instead well-connected elites and special interest groups. So again, we can begin to notice the differences. Under Nomocracy, the state oversees a rules-based order, and the citizens are to abide by the rules-based order. Whereas in a teleocracy, the state grants itself the latitude to pursue the vaguely defined common good of particular people or groups. In other words, a teleocratic state becomes much more agentic and is much more empowered to meddle in all levels of society, thus embodying the old phrase, the ends justify the means. Further, under our current version of teleocracy, the very idea that people should abide by a rules-based order is viewed itself as a form of oppression. And the quite predictable outcome of this viewpoint is a sort of lawlessness and anarcho-tyranny on the streets of many American and European cities. F.A. Hayek determined that a nomocracy is the only way by which to guarantee liberty. Under a teleocratic system, your freedom and liberty are just speed bumps on the road to achieving the allegedly virtuous ends that the governing and administrative elites are pursuing at any given moment. Returning to Lloyd, the term teleocracy in this work means the designed and dependent policy outcomes for the functions of the state through governing or administrative elites. As a description, teleological is used to represent an end-dependent form of thought. For nomocracy, the meaning used in this work is that of an established end-independent process, and rules that reflect pluralist and democratic majoritarian means by which choices lead to policies. As a description, nomological is used to represent an end-independent form of thought. Here, end-dependent in a teleocracy means that the final goal is the only thing that matters. Rules, norms, logic, and causality be damned. The means by which the ends are achieved are irrelevant. As Stalin once said that Vladimir Lenin had said, there are no morals in politics, only expedients. In other words, tell the masses a good story and you get to do whatever you want. Lloyd continues, the distinction between the two orientations constitutes the dichotomies between means and ends, or of cause and effect. Nomocracy corresponds with means, or the process, and teleocracy corresponds with the ends, or the stated goal of the policies. The left-right political belief system tends to adopt separate orientations related to teleocratic or nomocratic policy forms, with both collectivism and statism being teleocratic, whereas individualism is nomocratic. Nomocracy implies the concepts of merit and equality, in which everyone starts at the same point or given the same opportunities. Teleocracy implies the concept of affirmative action and equity, in which everyone ends at the same point. We can stop here and make a point about equity. Equity is achieved when the masses are equally impoverished and equally dependent on the state apparatus. It says nothing about the wealth or privilege of the managerial ruling class, for they are exempted from the so-called equity standards. As I have said before, socialism is the false god of managerialism, and that is all. It was in the Soviet Union, it is in communist China, and it will be no different in the West. Prior to psycho-progressivism, we had regular progressivism, described by Lloyd in the following passage. Progressivism was one of the statist belief systems that perceived support for the general welfare over individual freedoms to be the role and purpose of the state. Progressivism as a political ideology developed in the late 19th century with the goal, or telos, of progress being sought by positive, i.e. affirmative, state action through its policymaking and implementation elements. During this period, the state shifted to be equated with administration or bureaucracy, ruled by the desks. As sociologists claim the responsibility for scientific administration of society, perfection of society was the goal, but the path was through the individuals. Progressivism was no less than the attempt to perfect humans and society through the coercive authority of the state by reshaping human behavior with the force of law. We can note the historical trajectory of progressivism as originating from the idea of tabula rasa, or the blank slate, the idea that the mind begins empty and that humans are infinitely malleable and perfectible so long as they are subjected to the right social engineering, which is something that has since been disproven countless times scientifically. But I would say the blank slate may not be 100% true, but it is probably true half the time. Probably around half of the population is very susceptible, and the worldview is almost entirely downstream of whatever social engineering they receive. This is the component of the masses that lacks critical thinking, is maximally conformist, and employs the go-along to get-along strategy. They are the fertile soil on which elite factions of the intelligentsia compete. This competition to provide them with slogans, simple explanations, and sentiment-driven narratives has in all likelihood been an age-old game. The same people that today parrot, echo, and vehemently espouse the managerial ideology of the West would have been found 100 years ago protesting in the streets to ban alcohol, or 500 years ago they would have been found in the streets yelling, cursing, and hurling insults at people who did not fit the narrow Christian morality standards in the centuries bygone, or, in extreme cases, Catharist zealots willingly throwing themselves upon the pyre. In effect, if they were to be transported throughout time, they could even be thought of as empty vessels that are indeed filled by whatever the establishment intelligentsia of the time wishes to fill them with. But as with most things, and especially with respect to state intervention, eventually progressivism began to drift off the rails, from merely improving the lives of the masses, which it was quite effective at, to some ultimate and sinister final form. Coincidentally, as I have described in other videos, this period where progressivism began to go off the rails roughly coincides with the final years of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and the grand ideological battle between East and West. During this same time, I would propose, the Western elite no longer faced any threats from any rival geopolitical powers. The game had been won. The Western elites, rather than investing in their own countries and their own citizens, went all in on China, funding it with trillions in foreign direct investment while skillfully using China to almost totally exfiltrate the means of production beyond Western borders, beyond the reach of the working class and the labor unions that still spoke of such quaint ideas as workers' rights, better pay, and better working conditions. With the turn of the millennium, the Western elites seemingly went all in on enriching themselves and extracting the wealth of the Western middle classes, and to cover their tracks, they needed to up the level of psychosis in their increasingly psychotic progressivism. To do so, they inflicted the ultimate status debuff on their population, subjective mental reality, in order to distract us from the cold surface of reality and its pesky causality, while our countries were being stripped and looted, would be the ultimate cover. But of course, this is merely my interjection and my opinion. Lloyd stays more objective and less speculative. In fairly typical academic fashion, this is chalked up to some kind of passive emergent madness. People will hearken back to the decadence and the fall of Rome as evidence that this is just a passive civilizational cycle, but I would propose that it is merely what the ruling class do once they have hit a peak in growth. Rather than continue to innovate after the peak, they seek to wall themselves off from threats from below, revolutionary challenges, Pareto's elite circulation, and instead of maintaining their population's competence, they seek to undermine it while they extract and pilfer the empire's wealth. Lloyd continues, with respect to progressivism, as developed here, the late 20th century witnessed a change in the old progressivism, not in the state's teleocratic methods, but of the telos itself. Teleocratic statism remained as the hallmark of all progressive efforts. The perfection of society through behavioral modifications of individuals, however, was no longer the guiding purpose of the state. The design today is based on a different form of reality, a subjective mental reality. Subjective mental reality does not necessarily lead to psychosis, but in this case it did. The new term to describe this 21st century political ideology is psychoprogressivism, teleocratic statism with a delusional telos. The collectivist regime can participate as a psychoprogressive belief system when it operates in the manner of a Weberian state, e.g., teleocratic collectivism with a delusional telos. Here, Lloyd attributes the rise of psychoprogressivism as a mere happenstance, just a series of well-intended policies that went a bit off the deep end, but I have grown tired of always granting the system and its agentic lever pullers the benefit of the doubt. I don't see it as a series of unintended consequences, but rather as the intended outcome, one that covers the tracks of 30-plus years of looting and bizarre policies that predictably lead in only one direction, to ruin. Further, in my opinion, the psychoprogressivist ideology just so happens to be the ideal ideology for the managerial regime, one designed, seemingly, to perfectly cover their crimes, to ward off the threat of populist uprisings, to maximize the dependency of the masses on the state, and to fuel their consolidation of power all across the West. And perhaps, if James Burnham is looking down upon us from the great beyond, he would agree. Lloyd elaborates on the incoherence of psychoprogressivist policies. Unlike other political ideologies, such as conservatism, that identifies a policy set preference and role for the state, psychoprogressivism does not have fixed policy preferences. The telos is incoherent and does not remain constant. Psychoprogressive traits tend to establish it as a political ideology of the left that is more prone to mind-dependent and teleological utopian political structures, as well as the statist orientation. Here again, I don't see the incoherence of psychoprogressivism as a bug, but rather as a feature. It is this very incoherence, one that originates from its demonization of causality and rationality, that makes it so powerful as an elite managerial ideology. Under psychoprogressivism, anything is justifiable to the masses so long as it is packaged in shiny, moralistic wrapping paper. There is no need to even present logical arguments, and thus any policy, no matter how destructive, is fair game as long as it maximally benefits the elite managers, speeds up the wealth pump, immiserates the Western masses, and forces us into greater and greater dependence on the state. You will own nothing, and you will be happy, and you will eat the bugs, and so on and so forth. Another feature of this subjective mental reality that has been foisted upon us is the demonization of causality, cause and effect, the very thing needed to make sense of the world and to deploy the scientific method, or perhaps most importantly, to hold the elite accountable. Lloyd elaborates, the notion of cause and effect is inherent in experimentation. When one condition changes, the effect changes. This is the basis for hypothesis testing. The concept of cause limits scientific study to a physical reality. Mental reality is incapable of scientific verification. Psychoprogressivism, however, as defined by its subjective mental reality, does not engage with cause and effect. It goes directly to the effect without cause. Psychoprogressivism then denies that from which something else proceeds with a dependence in being. Again, from the perspective of the managerial elite, what better condition could be brought about than to deprive the masses of causality, the only means by which to hold the elites accountable? Just another feature and not a bug, in my opinion. As Randall Lloyd wrote an entire book on this very fascinating subject, I will only briefly outline the trajectory that brought us to our present condition. He traces Western civilization through the Industrial Revolution and to the resulting disenchantment and alienation that this brought about. The same disenchantment and alienation that led Marx to create his potent revolution-precipitating ideology, one that claimed to be scientific, but in reality was anything but. He discusses the ideological movement known as antinomianism, or the rejection of rules and laws, and he explores the impact of psychoanalysis on the Western consciousness. He traces the origins of psychoprogressivism from Marx to Antonio Gramsci, on through the Frankfurt School and into the 1960s counterculture, one fueled by CIA-provided LSD, and through the rise of New Age spirituality in the 1980s. Also discussed are the Marxist-inspired scholars of postmodernism, the potent ideology that sought to destroy the notion of objective truth and replace it with the purely subjective and relative. His analysis is very thorough, and if you're interested, I'd suggest buying the book and reading it for yourself, as it is also a good primer on the political and philosophical history of the West. Although Randall Lloyd's term, psychoprogressivism, may be new to many of you, this ideological constellation, postmodernism, identity politics, critical theory, Neo-Marxism, so-called wokeism, climate change as oppression, etc., is probably already very familiar to you, and I won't trace its contours in detail. You are either already very familiar with it and strongly dislike it, or you are an apologist. And in any case, you have probably already come to your own conclusions on the matter. The last 5 or so years can basically be described as the West, wasting hundreds of millions of hours worth of brain power discussing this deranged ideological constellation in detail, so we won't throw any more cognitive energy onto the scrap heap. But I did want to touch briefly on some of the core ideological elements, where they originated from, and why they make this ideology perfect for protecting the power of the managerial regime. First, we'll ask the question, if orthodox Marxism originally focused on the unifying concept of class-based struggle, how did it eventually lead to the modern, hyper-divisive form of Neo-Marxism that predominates in the West? Here, Lloyd elaborates, orthodox, quote-unquote, scientific Marxist doctrine expected the spontaneous socialist revolution to occur among factory workers in the industrialized West. Instead, the first socialist revolution took place in non-industrialized Russia, full of agrarian peasants, and had not been spontaneous, but undertaken by a vanguard of intellectual elites. As an aside, the fact that the Russian Revolution was not spontaneous and was instead led by a vanguard of intellectual elites is a classic example of Pareto's elite circulation theory. The idea that the masses rise up spontaneously is a myth. All revolutions occur when an organized counter-elite galvanizes a sufficient portion of the immiserated and disorganized masses, and then the counter-elites use the masses as an instrument to overthrow the existing ruling class. Another axiom that leads to this phenomenon is Mosca's law. An organized minority will always rule the disorganized majority, for the simple fact that the masses are inherently disorganized and thus cannot lead themselves to do much of anything without elite organization and leadership. And even if the masses did manage to spontaneously organize, organization inherently leads to hierarchy, oligarchy, and a new elite. This is Michel's iron law of oligarchy. These three laws, Mosca's law of the rulers and the ruled, Pareto's elite circulation theory, and Michel's iron law of oligarchy, make up the trinity of elite theory, or what could be called the only scientific, logical, experimental sociological theory. Antonio Gramsci, the progenitor of what would later become intersectionality and identity politics, was influenced by Pareto's work, and we will discuss him further in a moment. In short, Gramsci, in an effort to bring about revolution, sought to tear the fabric of society apart, and instead of stoking class-based divisions, which didn't seem to work well in the sufficiently affluent West, he would focus instead on destroying the very cultural fabric of Western civilization. To understand why the Western industrialized masses did not rise up spontaneously, something they could not figure out because they were burdened and clouded by being adherents of a utopian ideology, Marxist scholars in the West would go on to develop what would be known as Western Marxism. To quote Lloyd, the term Western Marxism describes a change in socialist tenets following the Russian Revolution in 1917. Russian scholars had to adhere closely to the party line of the revolution to ensure its success. In the West, on the other hand, scholars were not part of that demand, and instead spent their time questioning why revolution was not successful in their own countries. The failure of orthodox Marxism became apparent across Europe after World War I. The most important aspect of the theory was that the revolution would be the spontaneous action of the proletariat. This did not develop, however. Here, to bring about their revolution, their obsessive fixation, something that perhaps Freud could have shed some light on, Western Marxists and the so-called third-generation academics changed their target. Rather than class, Marxism was to become about culture. Lloyd describes this as the shift from a single class-based source of oppression to one based on a multitude of oppressions. To quote Lloyd, the third-generation academics settled on more than economic, labor-capitalist, proletarian-bourgeoisie relations as the source of the revolutionary struggle. Culture came to reflect the sources of oppression, which Marxist scholars sought to understand. These scholars included George Lukács, Karl Korsch, Antonio Gramsci, and Wilhelm Reich, along with the Frankfurt School scholars that constituted the 1970s trend towards cultural Marxism. The theories of Western Marxism began to develop soon after the collapse of the Soviet Revolution. George Lukács was among the first Western Marxists to focus on culture instead of class struggle. His 1923 book, History and Class Consciousness, was a highly influential collection of essays advocating the utopian socialist restructuring of society. Society was an organic whole, with each element understandable only in relation to the other parts. This philosophical outlook required the rejection of orthodox Marxism with its single-minded, scientific, historical materialism. Struggle against oppression was more than class struggle. There were a multitude of oppressions. And here, I would say, we can see what the real animating spirit behind Marxism is. It is simply an ideology that seeks to foment revolution. And whatever comes after this revolution occurs is merely some penciled-in, poorly thought-out nonsense. If the revolution does not happen because of class-based struggle, an ardent Marxist will merely go on to find other points of conflict to exploit. Their goal is one thing, revolution, and that is all. In Western Marxism, since Western culture and Western civilization itself was viewed to be the main impediment, an inoculant against Marxist revolution, to architect the revolution that they so obsessively fixated over, they set their sights on Western culture itself. Lloyd goes on to discuss Karl Korsch, who also sought to precipitate revolution by any means necessary. Korsch criticized orthodox Marxism in practice for its lack of planning to achieve the revolution, and eventually its willing coexistence with capitalism. Orthodox Marxists had lost the revolutionary spirit, instead relying on the inevitability of history. Korsch considered cultural conditions in society as the basis for revolution. Relying on an amorphous inevitability was insufficient. Here, he understood the need to see the condition of every aspect of society as the precursor to revolution, not merely the economic class struggle. He eventually emigrated to the United States, where he taught sociology, and after the war, briefly joined the Institute for Social Research of the Frankfurt School. So already, we can begin to see the clear drift from orthodox Marxism's focus on class-based struggle and a pivot to attacking Western culture in order to bring about the revolution that they so impatiently thirsted for. Antonio Gramsci was perhaps the most innovative in this department, fully moving beyond the realm of materialism and economism and on to targeting culture and the so-called thought hegemony. The revolution would not be founded on a class war, but a culture war. In the West, the masses already had a high quality of life, and as such, promising to deliver them material abundance was not sufficient to recruit the masses to their side. To quote Lloyd, "The error of economism was central to Western Marxism's critique of orthodox Marxism more broadly. Collectivists rejected economism as it meant passivity and waiting for the inevitable that never arrived. Instead, capitalism had stabilized as working conditions improved. Therefore, culture war was necessary to establish the conditions for revolution." Gramsci's theory of hegemony, dominance by social groups, was the analysis of why the proletariat lacked the revolutionary impulse. The hegemony of the ruling class meant that the ideas of society are those of the ruling class. The domination of society occurred in thought more than in force. The dominated in society adopted the ideas of the ruling elite by consent, which made them docile in the face of oppression. The way forward after the war was to break down the dominant hegemony into multiple thought hegemonies and social groups, which would lead to a cultural and political transformation prior to revolutionary action. This required a culture war by the oppressed for hegemony of society, of thought control, as precursor to revolution. And here we can begin to see the genesis point for the subjective mental reality in which we live today and its utility for the managerial mesh. The masses were to be reprogrammed and siloed into smaller and smaller identity and grievance-based groups, into the cognitive framework of multiple fragmented thought hegemonies. Once their unified and coherent worldviews were shattered, the worldview that existed under the so-called bourgeois hegemony, they then fall under the influence of these new neo-Marxist vanguard elites who would collectively manage these disparate identity and grievance-based silos. In our modern system, these groups have been converted into dependent client groups that are used to launder and divert taxpayer money for the purpose of both patronage and outright theft. In the language of Pareto, this is a Class 1 fox strategy meant to usurp and dissolve the pre-existing order that was held and maintained by the Class 2 lions of the old order. However, as with all Marxist variants, the fixation was only on revolution and the vague promise of some sort of utopia at the end of the road. How exactly this utopia would be delivered is never practically discussed. Plus, any rational person knows utopias are impossible, but this is not an ideology for the rational. However, Machiavellian dark triad types know that the best way to entice the masses is to promise them the impossible utopia, all the better to trick them so that they can use the masses instrumentally to install themselves into power so that they can enrich themselves at a later date. The goal is merely to destabilize the existing society, erode the cultural values and the rules-based order for the purpose of generating disorder, entropy, decay, and revolutionary fervor within the masses. If this occurs, the Marxist vanguard elite can then use the radicalized masses instrumentally to install themselves into power, and then, as with all Marxist revolutions, fail to deliver the utopia in the aftermath. But since thought control would have already been established, totalitarian methods would merely be turned on the masses to keep them from noticing and discussing the obvious. The utopia is never coming. Then ideological zealots, interspersed throughout the masses, are used as free-roaming automata to police the boundaries of the new thought-controlled dogma. This has occurred in every variant of the Marxist experiment, and it is the logical outcome. But if causality is demonized and expelled from the cognitive toolkit of the masses, the trick can be deployed time and time again. The rejection of logic, rationality, and causality in favor of a teleological, the ends justify the means orientation, sought to paper over the glaring fact that Marxists never provide a pragmatic path towards their promised utopia. The true intent, the true end, the true goal is merely the revolution, and to install the Marxist vanguard elite into power, that is all. In effect, because the Western masses were too wealthy for the plan to work, the Western Marxists had to first derange and immiserate the masses in order to radicalize them into a revolutionary frame of mind. Once the masses had been reprogrammed into their own subjective grievance-based hegemonies under the command of the Marxist vanguard elite, the masses would become successfully divorced from the previous thought hegemony that had brought them such success in the first place. Further, as statism and managerialism is inherently collectivist in orientation and teleological in its execution, We can see how this process worked to neutralize the individual and the rules-based order that had predominated under the Nomocracies of the West. Governance based upon a rules-based order, individual agency, merit, and a willingness to adhere to the rules-based order. The very things that made Western civilization the wealthiest, most innovative, and most powerful civilization in human history. Further, with respect to the idea of the West needing a new sentiment-based managerial ideology, this destructive, id-based fixation of Gramsci on destroying society and fomenting revolution would be co-opted by the very Western power structures he sought to usurp. There would be no glorious revolution, but instead, the groundwork that Gramsci laid out would be used successfully by the Western managerial regime to immiserate the Western masses, extract the middle-class wealth, and to maximize the dependency of the masses on a managerial regime that increasingly exhibited a delusional telos. But perhaps this telos is only delusional if you take it at face value. In reality, it may have been a purely rational move on the part of the managerial elite, as this ideology was used as a cover story for the biggest wealth extraction in the history of the world, and to exfiltrate the means of production beyond Western borders and into the hands of their managerial friends in China. And that point alone is interesting. In orthodox Marxism, the materialist focus was on the means of production, but under Western Neo-Marxism, the masses had become dazzled by abstract, sentimental nonsense, and many people even celebrated as the means of production were outsourced to China in the name of ending the greatest oppression of all, the oppression of Mother Earth by the scourge of CO2. Further, the anti-logic and anti-rational framework of this neo-Marxism would be used to obscure the fact that the CO2 was still being generated, more than ever in fact, from China's hyper-polluting, coal-burning power plants. But that is just another feature of subjective mental reality and not a bug. To quote Burnham, if we try to understand ideologies by merely taking their words at face value as if they were scientific statements of fact, we can never fully comprehend history and politics, nor can we do any better by explaining great events as inconsistencies and hypocrisies. Gramsci failed to realize that the power structures in the West were already becoming too complex, too wealthy, and too powerful. By the time the Soviet Union fell, they controlled almost the entire globe. Then they deployed Gramsci's id-based revolutionary fantasy for their own utilitarian ends. Once the new millennium passed, the psychoprogressivism would go into hyperdrive, fueling the wealth pump, concentrating wealth, and immiserating the masses. Instead of his glorious revolution, his ideology would be co-opted and infiltrated from the inside out by such agents as the Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse, who just so happened to work for the predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency. True power co-opts and corrupts all, especially the foolish, id-based destructionists. They are always the first to be co-opted and used instrumentally by those who most skillfully, logically, and rationally manage and manipulate complex systems. Today, Western leftists think they are learning to fight the power from within their universities, the very institutions that are controlled by the power structures themselves. The same universities funded, managed, and infiltrated by the Central Intelligence Agency, the managerial elite, and unnamed deep state actors. They are merely cosplaying as revolutionaries and are mere marionettes, tethered by an invisible string under the influence of ideology and moving under the control of an unseen hand. And above all, their truth regime of subjective mental reality enables their role as useful idiots. For the privileged Western masses, the idea of actively working to destabilize and destroy your society in which you live is an objectively terrible, illogical, and irrational idea, and it only makes sense from within the delusional bounds of the cognitive prison that they occupy, one constructed for them by the very elites that claim to be trying to liberate them. We, the masses, live in society, and we lack the resources to protect ourselves when it decays and descends into chaos. The elites do not live in society, they live above it. And if all goes to hell, they take their Ubers to their Manhattan apartments or to their gated communities or employ private security to protect themselves from the chaos on the streets. If absolutely necessary, they move themselves and their assets somewhere overseas to a place that will welcome them and their wealth with open arms. The elites are independent, wealthy, have agency, and are mobile. The masses are not. And further, it is these very things, independence, wealth, agency, and mobility, that they wish to take from you so that you become terminally dependent on their mass state. We'll return to Lloyd and discuss the institutional architecture needed to conduct the societal reprogramming. This is often referred to as the long march through the institutions, and is often thought of as evidence of the slow, creeping infiltration of Marxist ideology throughout Western societies. However, we must always remember that this so-called long march was allowed to happen. The universities, or any groups of so-called activists for that matter, are fully infiltrated by the intelligence community and are often directly managed by the regime's NGO constellation. If they did not find the long march to be useful for them in a utilitarian sense, they would not have funded and promoted it to such a high degree. Now, the truth of this is that we can never know, as the intelligence community is impenetrable and relies on an onion layer of deception to mask its intent. But in my opinion, I assume that it was allowed, promoted, and funded because neo-Marxist ideology was eventually co-opted and formed into the ultimate managerial ideology, the one that Burnham only speculated about in the 1940s, one that would nearly centralize and totalize all power into the hands of the state, into the hands of the managerial technocratic ruling class and the managerial mesh. To quote Lloyd, "For Gramsci, intellectuals must lead the way to consciousness of disparate interests prior to remaking society through the development of multiple thought hegemonies. Education of separate social interests beyond economic class was part of the Cultural Revolution planned for schools and universities. This would take place through infiltration, or the long march through the institutions as it came to be known in the 1960s. The precursor to the revolution was the spread of new thought, to separate social movements as part of the accretion of power by groups in a struggle against the dominant bourgeois social structure. Once the oppressed groups gained power, the revolution could proceed. Collectivism would advance by stages rather than any single revolution. The emphasis on social movements anticipated and influenced the rise of identity politics and the control of education institutions." Now, this notion of publicly discussing plans to infiltrate something is patently absurd. More likely, if we think of ourselves within the multi-layered onion of the intelligence community, an infiltrator is merely allowed to infiltrate, the path ahead for them carefully pruned and manicured to funnel them to just the right places, to do just the right things. Next, we'll briefly discuss the Frankfurt School, perhaps one of the most controversial areas, but one in which the intent behind this ideology becomes more clear, especially with regard to its goal of forcing a subjective mental reality and in dissolving society. To quote Lloyd, the Frankfurt School, as it was known in the 1960s to the countercultural left, engaged in a critique of rationality, which is what attracted the new left to their earlier writings. The Modern Family was a target of the Institute scholars with a collection of reports in 1936, and Max Horkheimer outlined the role of the family in maintaining order. The bourgeois patriarchal family represented the modern division of labor and family relations. The father, by virtue of strength and role of money possessor, which makes the family dependent, becomes the focus of authority. The bourgeois patriarchal family, which instills submission to authority in children, expresses the regard for authority in society more broadly. The family socialization process supports the authoritarian state. This is a big eye roll for me. There's always an authority somewhere, and children especially should not be allowed to run around willy-nilly, do whatever they want, and not have to answer to any authority figures. The claim that being forced to listen to your father when you are a child is a form of socialization that prepares you for submission to the bourgeois authoritarian state is absurd and is itself delusional. Children have been forced to listen to their parents since time immemorial, and thus such a connection is preposterous, non-specific, and completely untethered from reality. But of course, we can see the methods of modern parenting that are promoted by the establishment and the so-called expert class, and we can see that they took the Western Marxists and the Frankfurters to heart. The same goes for the education system. Modern system-compliant teachers are forced to say things like, "I may be a teacher, but I have just as much to learn from my students as you do from me." Such a statement is just another example of subjective mental reality in the delusional telos. No wonder kids can't read anymore, can't write complex sentences, and don't know math, because their teachers are forced to say things like that. But in the delusional telos, it is a perfectly acceptable mainstream viewpoint. The ends always justify the means, because the delusional Telos seeks to destroy the nuclear family and society, and because it is a so-called bourgeois institution that exists beyond the control of the state. And with respect to the modern anti-teachers, making young people dumber by withholding a proper education, logic, causality, mathematics, and quantitative reasoning, and instead programming them to only think in subjective and emotional terms, is just another feature and not a bug. This fixation on destroying the nuclear family is often discussed in an overly salacious manner by the right, but to me it is merely done to reorient the reprogrammed populace into seeing the state as the father and protector, and encourages dependency on the state. Bonus points because it also maximizes consumerism and the wealth extraction rate of the wealthy middle class, the holders of the so-called oppressive bourgeois values. The nuclear family is one of the primary means by which an individual can pool resources, save money, and divide labor. If we think of this in the context of what actually happened, our modern era of hyperconsumption, compulsive buying with credit cards, and atomization, dividing the nuclear family merely seeks to reduce the savings rate of individuals. It forces you to waste your money on products and services that used to be provided by or in collaboration with your family, things like food, housing, childcare, etc. The same goes for the push to destroy marriage, although this is merely a luxury belief, as the rich white liberals still tend to get married. They just discourage you from doing so. When you're single, you have to pay all the rent, all of the utilities, buy and eat all the food, etc., etc., and thus it is less economically efficient than being partnered up with a long-term spouse. In the end, the Occam's razor of reduction always leads back to money. This to me is the ultimate pivot point where the New Left ideology becomes the ideal managerial ideology for Western countries and for facilitating wealth extraction. Otherwise, at face value, it is merely some kind of adolescent rebellion fantasy, another utopia. At the end of the day, every person must submit to something. The atomized, impoverished, and deranged individual, once stripped of their family, merely becomes a dependent ward of the state. But with respect to the rest of this history and theory, I will skip it because it becomes quite repetitive. As a formula, it effectively fractalizes oppression and grievance. Anything and everything within the legacy system is a source of oppression, and any discussion of agency or causality is explicitly avoided and rejected. Any disparate outcome is inherently a sign of structural oppression. Any need to submit or conform to any legacy norm is rejected as oppressive. Consequences for an individual's actions are all irrelevant because there is no causality. Only the ever-present, pervasive field of societal oppression is the explanation for any and all social phenomenon. Ultimately, it is an ideology that teaches the adherent to embrace a learned helplessness and throw away any individual agency. The only choice is to tether yourself to the state and allow the state to provide for you. With respect to the subjective mental reality, we will also discuss postmodernism, which itself arose from Marxist or Marxist-adjacent scholars. Although one could disentangle the various scholars, I merely view Western Marxism, the postmodernists, the deconstructionists, and the post-structuralists on some kind of continuum or as an ideological constellation. Although the postmodernists have many interesting points from an intellectual and philosophical perspective, as a political ideology that seeks to implement its vision in the real world, it is inadvisable to say the least. At best, it is something that should be confined to the intellectual sphere and not forcibly projected onto the masses, for doing so is inherently destructive. But today, we all ultimately live in the mental reality that the postmodernists unleashed. To quote Lloyd, postmodernism was the culmination of rebellion. The counterculture rebelled against social convention and restrictions. Postmodernism rebelled against the constrictions of reality and sought ultimate freedom against the physical forces of nature by demanding that only mental forces exist. Postmodernism was a parallel movement to post-structuralism. The ideas revolve around evocation of extreme skepticism about knowledge, truth, and objective reality. At its center, it is also a rejection of modernity and what that implies for scientific objectivity, for knowledge, and the sterility of a reductionist, materialist, mechanistic universe. Postmodernism is not properly something that comes after modernism. It is best defined as returning to a pre-modern state, a primitive state of nature, in the opposite direction of progress, to one of retrogression. Here we can really see the outlines of subjective mental reality taking shape. Nothing is real, everything is a construct, and thus nothing matters. Learn to parrot this phrase and you will seem so smart. Oh, but don't you know, that is just a construct, hee. The ways in which such an ideology could be maliciously deployed against the masses by the elites is nearly limitless. but we can also see the outlines of what would become the groundwork for climate catastrophism and anti-humanism. Science, technology, and society is alienating. Man's alienation from nature is the highest form of oppression, and to return man to nature, to the primeval state of chaos and to the cruel laws of the jungle, is somehow preferential to living in a modern society. And of course, without science, technology, and society, the 8 billion people on Earth would almost all die, except for the elites, of course, who hold vast resources. Then the planet could be allowed to heal, and the surviving elites could all commune with nature somewhere on a pristine ski resort somewhere outside of Davos, or something like that anyway. Returning to Lloyd, postmodernism was the 20th century rejection of the Enlightenment and its projects. Reality was a mental process, not a perceptual one. Dominant classes of elites were responsible for disseminating their form of reality. However, no single culture or community had a claim to the sole reality, because there was no universal truth. With reality constructed locally, any society was as valid as any other. Multiculturalism asserted that any way of life was owed communal respect. To deny all expressions of existence their valid place was bigotry. Judgment was prohibited, except to judge those who judged. Postmodernism was where the individual held claim to a subjective reality. Now, theoretically, much of this is true, but for practical utilitarian purposes, in addition to animating subjective mental reality, it was used to justify mass migration and open borders in the West over the past several decades. Western culture, since all cultures are mere constructs, was to be trivialized, demonized, and spat upon, while all other versions of culture were to be maximally promoted and glorified by the managerial establishment. To question the practices of other cultures was verboten, and to suggest any causal link between cultural practices and disparate outcomes was entirely off limits. Remember, there is no causality allowed in subjective mental reality. But of course, Western culture had to be denounced and demonized, or realistically, demonizing Western culture itself became a top-down imperative from the elite power structures. The reason for this is simple. Western culture itself held the last vestiges of the old system, the old gods, and the last remnants of the lions, the ones the managerials sought to destroy and replace with their new managerial ideology of psychoprogressivism. In practice, this, along with the identity politics of Western Marxism, allowed the managerial regime to maximally deploy their client group strategy, import millions of immigrants into the shrinking economy, plagued by inflation, and one where the jobs are outsourced to China, use the establishment infrastructure to preferentially serve the immigrant communities, while at the same time depleting and extracting the wealth of the Western middle classes to solidify and totalize all power in the managerial mass state. To destroy the last castle that was not under their control, the middle class. This is the instrumental utility. Like Stalin said, that Vladimir Lenin had said, there are no morals in politics, only expedience. The Western middle classes were an independent power center. They had wealth, and they were somewhat independent from the state. To totalize all power, the state and the managerial mesh had to destroy the middle class, siphon off our wealth, and neutralize our ability to challenge power. And using verbal magic, they said, anyone who questions the true intent behind these policies is a bigot, and that is all. To quote Lloyd, the central aspects of postmodernism were applied to cultural, social, and political life. Universities were a primary location for the dissemination of the new themes. Postmodernism followed concepts of Marxism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction, and it rejected objective reality, dualism, and rationality. Objective reality was not possible, nor was the truth, which was a product of the scientific method related to objectivity. Only subjective truth was possible and grounded in will and emotion. Here, however, we can point out that the status quo, the establishment, and the managerial elite did still get to insist on their single truth, however. Their truth regime was beyond questioning. So in effect, as power rules on the exception, all other versions of the so-called truth were cast aside or demonized in favor of the truth of the managerial regime. This is especially the case when it comes to the postmodernist rejection of the grand narrative. All grand narratives are false, except those that are forcibly projected onto the masses via the regime's informational apparatus. To reject the truth regime of the managerial elite is to find yourself in hot water, but in that hot water you will boil away with the other frogs. But if you so choose, you may climb out while you still can. To reiterate Burnham's quote, if we try to understand ideologies by merely taking their words at face value as if they were statements of scientific fact, we can never comprehend history and politics, nor can we do any better by explaining great events as inconsistencies and hypocrisies. This insistence that all meta-narratives be rejected with the exception of the regime's preferred, ever-shifting, ever-incoherent narrative is an example of a so-called inconsistency or hypocrisy, but this is merely power at work, for power always rules on the exception. To quote Lloyd, meta-narratives or grand narratives provide a unifying function to a people by providing a comprehensive overview of history and society premised on common truths or values. Meta-narratives are stories we tell ourselves about the guiding structures of our lives. Unifying narratives in the United States have included American exceptionalism, the Enlightenment idea of rational scientific social progress, the advances due to capitalism, and the American experiment in popular sovereignty. These are the things that have been valued in society. Postmodernism was an attack on these unifying stories, which left in their wake only atomistic social tendencies and small relativistic narratives. No shared national identity was allowed, only hyphenated ones. Yes, atomize, derange, divide, and cast doubt. In the mining industry, one first finds mineral-rich rock, then you break the rock, then you crush the rock and chemically leach it to extract and concentrate its valuable mineral components. This is what was done to the Western middle classes to extract their wealth, and postmodernism and subjective mental reality was the key to bypass any lock. Just give up, lose your agency, everything you thought was true is false, and submit to the mass managerial state. But it is also preposterous, and you are free to reject the managerial regime's narrative, because postmodernism, like all ideologies, is rife with contradictions. If all meta-narratives are false, you are free to step out of the cognitive prison that has been built for you, and you are free to reject the managerial regime's meta-narrative constellation. Postmodernism is a double-edged blade without a handguard. It can be used just as easily in the opposite direction. My ideology is that if you throw a ball up into the air, the ball comes back down. Re-embrace logic, rationality, causality, and systems theory, for it is grounded in physical reality and is not one of mental verbal magic. Lloyd elaborates, the argument is also made that postmodernism, its incredulity to meta-narratives, is itself a meta-narrative and thus refutes itself. The skepticism about knowledge, truth, or right and wrong, and that we should reject any grand meta-narrative means that we should reject the meta-narrative truth imposed by postmodernism, that there is no truth, no knowledge, or right and wrong. Postmodernism is the matrix, and you can step out at any time. Before we discuss the silver linings and reversals of the Western managerial ideology and its preferred weapon, the infliction of subjective mental reality on the masses, I wanted to tie this back into James Burnham. Here, Burnham writes to us from 1941, and he lays out the triple problem faced by the managers. To quote Burnham, we saw that the managers and the future managerial society are faced with the triple problem. 1, to reduce the capitalists, both at home and finally throughout the world, to impotence. 2, to curb the masses in such a way as to lead them to accept managerial rule and to eliminate any threat of a classless society. And 3, to compete amongst themselves for first prizes in the world as a whole. To solve the first two parts of this problem, the third part is never wholly solved, means the destruction of the major institutions and the ideologies of capitalist society and the substitution for them of the major institutions and ideologies of managerial society along the lines that we have already surveyed. To accomplish this solution, large sections of the masses must be enlisted under suitable slogans on the side of the managers and the managerial mesh. Like the capitalists, the managers do not as individuals do the bulk of the fighting, which is part of the process of social transition. This they leave to the masses. Even the fighting, which in addition to the change in ideology is needed to curb the masses, is done by one section of the masses in combat against other sections. And here we find the so-called long march through the institutions to re-educate one section of the masses under new managerial ideology, the one that I have proposed here and the one described by Randall Lloyd as psychotic progressivism, the delusional Telos, one underwritten by subjective mental reality. Further, as we have seen over the past 5 years in the streets, one section of the masses are indeed sort of battling and fighting the other. However, in reality, it is much more often the case that in the US and in Europe, what we are really seeing in the streets is a portion of the masses who are artificially boosted, funded, and protected by the managerial institutions, the corporate media, and the NGO constellation, abstractly and performatively fighting the remnants of the system on behalf of the Western managerial regime. I covered this topic in more detail in a past video about synthetic counter-revolutions. For all those who push the mainstream or sub-mainstream narrative of a quote-unquote civil war, I don't think that will happen. Instead, we will be exposed to a simulated civil war in simulacra. In the West, the decentralized system of laissez-faire bourgeois capitalism, even back in Burnham's day, was on its last legs and was rapidly being replaced by Western managerialism's new teleocratic rule, one where the ends always justify the means, and those ends will always benefit the managers and serve to further consolidate their power. We could say that the silent managerial revolution then went into overdrive sometime around the turn of the millennium. It sought to finish its job of solidifying power, and at that point, one of the last remnants of the old decentralized system of bourgeois capitalism that remained was the Western middle classes itself. Those who were somewhat wealthy owned assets, houses especially, were independent from the state, and still maintained the legacy value system. The nuclear family, individual agency, and orientation towards merit and the rule-based order of the legacy Nomocracy. In other words, their last target was the decimation of the Western middle classes, and in my opinion, they were very successful at their task. Once the boomers pass away, almost all the wealth will have been extracted. The last 30-plus years is the culmination of their work. As the old World Economic Forum adage goes, you will own nothing, and you will be happy, and you'll eat the bugs, and so on and so forth. But anyway, as promised, we will finish by searching for silver linings. Although this is perhaps unlikely, we can view what has occurred over the past 10 years, the societal derangement, the division, and the foisting of a subjective mental reality onto the Western masses as a sort of inoculation or vaccine against information war, and the potential AI-precipitated hyper-reality that is to come. Our great power rival, China, or any foreign power for that matter, cannot harm us with information war, because we have already harmed ourselves in a controlled way. At present, there's literally no information, no revelation, and no narrative that can completely destabilize our already fragmented and siloed population, a population that mostly lives in a subjective mental reality, beyond the bounds of facts, evidence, and logic, and thus our information system can be viewed as anti-fragile. Whereas in contrast, China relies on strict narrative control and must keep their masses unified under a single worldview, and another term for that is informational fragility. Perhaps in some back conference room nestled somewhere inside the Central Intelligence Agency or some unknown agency, this whole thing was like a four-dimensional chess move. Because although the U.S. has sacrificed its industrial base over the past 30 years, it has heavily invested in tech, and the U.S. and U.S. tech companies effectively control the global internet, the global information space. If a nation tries to shut its population off from our informational flows, Starlink receivers will merely be smuggled in by the U.S.'s all-encompassing network of intelligence assets, and Elon will be told to turn Starlink on, and the U.S.'s informational matrix will seep in any corner of the globe. Also, our internet is more fun and it is more free. China's internet is very boring and not free at all. You may write that off as a triviality, but I assure you it is not. Over the past 30 years, the English language has become ever more dominant across the globe, especially among young people who tune in to watch the same streamers, influencers, vloggers, and internet commentators as we do, and on the same platforms, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and so on and so forth. Perhaps if we wish to grant our deep state overseers the benefit of the doubt, perhaps what they have engineered here is a long-term 4D chess gambit. Outsource industry to China, let them grievously pollute their environment, deplete their population, build resentment in developing countries when Chinese goods flood, saturate, and displace their local industry, and let China speedrun many of the same crises that we have. A demographic crisis, a youth unemployment problem, a demoralized youth problem, artificial housing bubbles, tremendous wealth inequality, and a debt crisis. Meanwhile, in the background, the U.S. pumped all of its remaining capital and energy into global tech dominance, control over the global information system, and ultimately in building AI. And from AI and automation, perhaps, if we are allowed to leverage it to the max, we could even enter a new era of abundance. The same abundance that the Western bureaucratic managerial faction is trying to constrain and limit. Bureaucratic managers gain their power by allocating scarce resources, and thus they make critical resources like energy more scarce. But the tech faction of the managerial elite, at least, seemingly wish for the opposite: energy abundance, less constrained speech, and unconstrained development of AI and technology. Technology, after all, is the only reason why there are 8 billion humans alive on the planet today. Without technology, many of us will die. The only way we can pull ourselves out of this stupid hole that has been dug around us by the bureaucratic managerial faction is to go all in on AI and hope that we can have a future that is different from the one planned for us by the World Economic Forum managers and the Davos class. And from what we saw during the pandemic period, that plan is also one of censorship and thought control. But in the great and never-ending battle of inter-elite competition and warring factions, the tech faction is the only power center that can outcompete the bureaucratic managers on the battlefield of complexity. Turn it up to level 99, flood the zone, and use their complexity edge to overwhelm the bureaucratic managers' desire to censor the information space, control the narrative, and silence anyone who speaks out against their managerial plans. Identity essentialized siloization, arbitrary and draconian speech codes, deindustrialization, scarcity, climate catastrophe, open borders, and their technocratic countermeasures against so-called harmful speech and harmful mis, dis, or malinformation. To outmaneuver them, the tech faction can maximally deploy AI, automation, and sensible, innovative energy policies like small modular reactors to usher in a new era of abundance. And from this abundance, the tech faction can win the favor of the conformist portion of the masses, and they will quickly forget all of the ideological nonsense that has been inflicted upon them over the past decade. In effect, a technocratic economism that delivers a basic, guaranteed standard of life, one that delivers materially for the people, and one that neutralizes the managerial faction's engineered scarcity and managed decline, the very root of their power. We can already see that the internet has become much more free today than it was 5 years ago, and if all else has been taken away from us, perhaps, we can hope that we will be left with the last remaining thing, perhaps the one thing that really matters: cognitive choice, cognitive liberty, and the freedom to climb out from the cage that we have been placed into, this deranging prison of a subjective mental reality, one where no logic, no rationality, and no causality is allowed. But if the Chinese model and their internet prevails, there will be no freedom, no cognitive liberty, and no fun. And the managerial bureaucrats of the European Union and their counterparts in the UK, Canada, and Australia seemingly wish the same thing. So, perhaps at the end of the day, that is something to hope for. Perhaps we'll all be allowed to continue to congregate on platforms like YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter to discuss crazy ideas, to be cognitively free, and to continue to explore and better understand the rapidly changing world around us. And if that world inevitably leads to a sort of hyper-reality, one where we come to realize that we have and always have lived inside of a layered onion of deception, manipulation, one of social engineering and of an unseen hand, perhaps we can learn to adapt and survive after having been passage through the tunnel of subjective mental reality, to be reborn and emerge somewhere on the other side, better equipped, more rational, more prepared, and cognitively hardened, because we have progressed too far to turn back. The ships have been burned, and now we are all here on a new frontier and on a new terrain. We can go forth boldly like the adventurers of bygone centuries, exploring the unexplored in a world where we had thought that everything there was to be discovered had been found. We may, at the end of the day, still own nothing, but perhaps we will not be forced to eat the bugs, and we will not be forced to live under the delusional Telos of the Western bureaucratic managerial faction, one where we are forced to repeat the slogans and the mantras and be screamed at by those who are denizens of the regime's preferred subjective mental reality, by the marionettes, tethered by an invisible string, under the influence of ideology and moving under the control of an unseen bureaucratic hand. But anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I hope you all had a nice new year, and thanks again, and have a nice day or night.